Welcome to a new series here at Reinventors on transforming government IT. I'm Peter Lydon and I'm the founder of Reinventors. Now this series is going to be somewhat different than other series we've done so far over the last couple of years here, in which we're going to really roll our sleeves up on this one and really get into the details of how to solve what is really a complex problem. We're going to start this general channel, you could say, of transforming government IT by looking closely at transforming government security and compliance issues. It's these issues which are kind of thwarting innovation or kind of gumming up the system and keeping people from really trying new things. And so the idea of this is to bring together top technologists from outside government in the private sector and get them talking with a lot of innovators inside government who really want to improve this. And through the course of these very complex and kind of nuanced conversations, help move the ball on this really important area. Now, to help guide us through this series, we've got an awesome host in the form of Greg Elin. Greg is really an open data expert who has experience both inside and outside government. He was one of the federal government's first chief data officers. In this case, he had that position in the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC. Before that, he helped start Sunlight Foundation's Sunlight Labs, which was really instrumental in helping bring Web 2.0 technologies and kind of open data approaches into civic tech. And currently, since leaving the FCC just recently, he started a new company called GovReady, and they're like a clearinghouse for helping to kind of certify what innovative kind of new technologies are actually secure and approved for government purposes. Now, he'll be the host. I'm going to turn it over to him in a second here. The other thing I just want to say is we have an awesome partners in this series, the Agile Government Leadership Group, which is essentially a group of Agile government professionals who are committed to moving Agile practices into government. We also have a company called Civic Actions, which is a private sector company that's doing a lot more work now with the federal government, and they are kind of living in a day-to-day way a lot of these issues that we're going to be grappling with in this series. But before we go around this awesome group that we've got assembled over video here, I do want to remind everyone that we believe no one's as smart as everybody. And so for those of you who are out there watching this live, we encourage you to ask questions, add comments. You can do that on our site, the Reinventors.net site, on the landing page that's where this is live streamed. You can do it in our Google Plus environment, which is kind of optimized for interaction and also comments. And you can also do it using the hashtag Reinventors, hashtag Reinventors in Twitter. We have people watching that. They'll be cycling in the best stuff. We might move it into the conversation here, but we certainly will live for our package of write-ups and videos that are come up by the end of the week. So for now, I'm going to turn it over to Greg and let him tee up the conversation for Dave. Greg.
Thank you, Peter. Welcome to Reinventor's Video Roundtable series, Transforming Government IT. This is our first Transforming Government IT Video Roundtable, and we have a great topic, loving both innovation and security. I'm going to be hosting this discussion, and I'm an ex-Govy myself, Greg Elin. It's pretty clear that citizens want innovative digital services from government. Yet, new technology and ideas in government IT often seem, at best, at odds with the equally important task of cybersecurity. So we have gathered 7 awesome individuals who are coming from government, private industry, and academia to chew over how we flip the innovation-security relationship to one of partnership. So I'm going to now go around the horn, and I'm going to introduce each of our panelists with a word about why I wanted them to participate in the discussion and what I think he or she brings to the table. And I'm also going to ask each person, by way of introducing themselves, to say a little bit about a current work activity or goal that they're pursuing, which would be improved if we loved both innovation and security more. So I'm gonna start with Henry Poole, who is the CEO of Civic Actions, and which has become a federal government prime contractor after a number of years of working with both federal government as a subcontractor as well as city and state government. And Henry is also a board member of the Free Software Foundation. And I think that he has a perspective of coming into this as a person that's beginning, as a company that's beginning to do more work with federal government, and coming from a background of open source and innovation. And so, Henry, if you could, how would your life or the activities you're doing be improved if we had more love for innovation and security?
Well, maybe my taxes would go down. But I think more practically, yeah, I had this conversation this morning at 9 o'clock. I don't know why I scheduled it, because I should have been preparing for this. But I talked to this guy, and I found out that he was at a big contractor, and he was in charge of innovation. And he was there for years and was just so frustrated about the complexities of getting things done, the simplest things done, and he left. And that to me is that's the challenge. We have people that are really, really bright, and they're stuck, they're resigned in their jobs, and some people just leave, and we have to attract. We've got to attract people into these government jobs that are excited and where they're making things happen. And so anyway, that's just an example. I think people. The people that really are excited, a lot of them are stuck, and they're leaving, and people don't want to join.
So Henry, you're describing that there's a human cost right now with some of the challenges that the people that want to bring change or do innovative things are often paying a personal cost that's discouraging people from working in government IT. I think that's a great point. And so let's bounce out from government to the private sector, and let me introduce Mike McGarr, who is, I'm going to let him give his title over at Netflix in doing DevOps. I have seen Mike give an awesome presentation on being a change agent. I know that Mike used to be based here in DC, and for everyone watching, Netflix within the DevOps and Agile community is highly regarded as a company that's very bold on both doing innovation as well as bravely facing and managing risks. So, Mike, can you let me turn it over to you to give your title and say a little bit about how something that you're working on could be impacted with a different relationship, or is impacted because of a different relationship.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So I manage the Build Tools team at Netflix, which is part of Engineering Tools, and my interest in this group is really, and participating in this panel was twofold, which is being from DC, used to do a lot of contracting in the government, and then now being in the Valley, I have this very colored perspective on my experiences back in DC, and really have a passion for making sure that government is successful, because I've seen some of the challenges of balancing innovation and security. But really, my experiences here at Netflix, we struggle with this on Engineering Tools, especially and I wouldn't say struggle, but like there's this balance between pushing innovation and security, as in, an example would be making sure that the whole infrastructure is on a solid version of, just say, the JVM, because we run a lot of things on Java. New JVM versions come out all the time. We have to make sure that we're vetting those, as well as moving the company at a reasonable pace, so we can take advantage of some of the features in newer languages, right? So balancing that speed as well as security and risk at the same time.
Right. So and I think there's an interesting point there that there's speed that comes from both the desire of the company to move forward, but also the reality that your supply chain changes and other situations change that you have to respond to.
Yeah.
So let me introduce next Matthew Burton, who, like me, have worked in government for a number of years. And Matt has an interesting history in that he was an early technology hire at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was a new agency that was stood up during the Obama administration, and has gotten a lot of attention because of their creative and forward-looking uses of technology. And Matt started in the Wild West of the agency starting up and went all the way to doing work as a Deputy CIO there, and has a very interesting experience from the developer side all the way to surviving audits. So, so I'm really happy that he's here with us, and he's got other talents and background as well. Matt?
Yeah, so like you said, Greg, I used to work in government. Now I work with government as a private contractor. I'm with a small company. We have about 10 people, and we have a couple of products that we are selling to the military and intelligence community. And we think they're great products, but when you're a small company, trying to figure out how to navigate the security process is very frustrating. If you're a big company like Boeing or Lockheed or SAIC, you've got people who live and breathe that process. And I want to separate the process from being a cybersecurity expert. You can be an expert at locking down a system and keeping attackers out, but it's a completely different thing to know how to take a technology product and get it approved for use on a government system. And what we really need is someone who can do the latter. And that is a very specialized skill, and it takes someone who knows people, it seems, a lot of the time. It seems like you need to speak a special language that no one else around you knows how to speak. So, you know, if you said at the beginning, how would it change my life personally if these two sides played better together? That's how we need to get our products accredited for use, and it's just a struggle. Forget about getting it accredited. It's a struggle to figure out what the process is. An old colleague of mine from CFPB liked to say that there are 3 black holes in government. One is procurement, another is hiring, and the third is cybersecurity. In that a lot of work happens in those, but if you're on the outside of that process, or if you need that process to work for you, once you submit your request to get something done, nothing, you don't get any feedback or insight into the process for many months at a time until one day you do.
So Matt has. We're going to come back to this because in addition to the aspect of security itself, there is this process of demonstrating that your system is secure. And there, as Matt was identifying, there's a lot of pain that I have also felt with that process. And now, from a small company outside that is seeking to get accreditation and battling with the process, I'd like to introduce Michael Byrne, who is at CFPB and heading up a small team that has a very important project with the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data. And Mike has a 20-plus year history, both at state government and in federal government, is actually a service award winner, so that we know, and I mentioned that to say that this is a person that takes end user quality and innovation in government very seriously. And I will also say, having had the fortune to work with Mike, he's a terribly nice guy and was far more diplomatic and respectful of the process inside of government than I was during my days, and I learned a great deal from him. So Mike, how if we could love security and innovation better, or if there was a way to think about risk, how would it be that would make your life easier?
Well, first, thanks so much for the warm introduction, Greg. I do. There was a long period of time, about 4 years, when Greg and I shared a wall together, and so I miss these kinds of conversations. Thanks for pulling me back into them. The short answer for me is, I think we would see 3 or 4 instant metrics. I think in general we would see a decreased time to deployment. Deployment of new things should go way faster when there's love between these two things. Corollarily, or as a corollary, we should see way more deployments. We know that, like, the Mike from Netflix was talking earlier about keeping on top of things. We know from reading their blog that they're producing truckloads of product. They're making commits, weekly. They're shipping new product all the time. We should see that in government. We should see lots of deployments. We shouldn't see a deployment, once every 6 months or once every year. Costs to deploy should go down dramatically when there's love between these two things. Generally speaking, as an employee, it would be way more fun. Like, I would just get more joy out of it if I'm publishing all the time, or if I can look at these metrics and see, my guys produced something that took, a half hour to make and less than that to deploy. We see where we can put in place technology today that's crazy quick to actually turn on if I had the right love, but then takes months, as Matt was articulating, maybe to get to market, and that just isn't fun for everyone. It's not fun for developers. It's not fun for consumers. It's not fun for the public. It's not fun for government. So
Mike, that was amazing, and it was an incredible setup for our next guest, Ward Cunningham, who, in some senses, is an inspiration and a beacon when it comes to speed and collaboration. As many people know, Ward is the individual who created the idea of the Wiki Web and wrote the first software. He blew my mind years ago telling me about that. But not only that, Ward was one of the original signatories to the Agile Manifesto. And I am really excited to have Ward here because I think that he, instead of looking at how to balance security and people that wanted to make changes, he figured out ways in which making the change is what made the platform resilient and powerful. And so I'm terribly glad that Ward is able to join us. And Ward, you're working on, I'm sure, a number of interesting things now, working with a popular company that's in the DevOps space. But what's your perspective on what could be made better if we had more love between security and innovation? Ward, I think you're still on mute.
Yeah, no, I'm not. I've always been fascinated by computer programming and just the power that's there at your fingertips, and how we make it difficult, unnecessarily difficult, and that's been kind of a life goal of mine, is to just, stop doing those things that make our work hard. The wiki was actually founded as a site for kind of inventing a new literature about computer programming. We'd had a decade in experimenting in a kind of a research environment, but we knew we had better answers, and they were just hard to describe. So we turned it over to the community and said, well, let's let the community leadership, develop the vocabulary that created what we now know as Agile, extreme programming, and even the DevOps, which is probably the most important incarnation of Agile, in recent years, is it is a set of practices where instead of working harder, instead of just being more diligent, that we solve system problems with systems instead of solving system problems by throwing people at it. And that leaves the people free to march ahead and solve the new problems. So this has always been kind of the way we feel. Wiki, of course, did that. And I thought it would last for 6 months, honestly. I knew that it was open to all kinds of vulnerability, and 20 years later, it's a very different world. And so I would say the best thing I got out of Wiki is to watch the internet evolve. Just the kind of people. It was kind of a collegiate community in 1995, and everybody expected a site to be different, and were devoted to figuring it out. And so that was made it easy to launch, and now it's very different. There's a lot of mean people on the internet, and this is where, I touch security. We need an immune system in everything we build. We want to be social animals, but we don't want to get sick, right? So there you go. I just want to make the world safe for the same kind of community that we once had 20 years ago with a wide open Perl script, and now do it with federation and stuff that's really kind of more modeled on how life itself works.
Very well. We're going to come back. This might be where we start. Dr. Ann Washington is also joining us, and Ann is pretty incredible. Not only did she work for the Library of Congress for 10 years, so she's another individual that has experience inside of government. She has an undergraduate degree in computer science. She has a PhD degree, I think I'm going to get it right, in information technology. And I think there are a couple of other degrees floating around in there as well. Ann and I have had some wonderful conversations about how people need to feel safe. And one of the reasons that I wanted to include Ann in this conversation is that she actually had the opportunity a little bit ago to do some very direct research on the relationship between innovation and failure, and is studying that area as well as some others. So, Ann, I know that your first reaction about talking around security was, not necessarily center in your bailiwick, but listening to what people have spoken about and in your own work around studying innovation or your experience in government, what do you think could be shifted?
Yeah, that's a great introduction. Thank you, Greg. In my mind, when we talk about security, we're talking about how to mitigate risk. And there are lots of ways to understand risk. The word has already come up so far. The work I do right now is really about big data policy and how can we think about data governance and data policy. And in these situations, we see risk and innovation coming up together all the time. From the simplest cases, like if you think of Google Flu Trends versus the CDC, there's a history of how we take care of health information and health data that we're having trouble translating it into the digital world. But I think once we start to unpack these ideas of, in order to have true innovation, we have to deal with the fact that we have to be secure with it. We can solve all of the world's health problems, but we also need to protect individual health data. So this tension is present in almost everything that's moving forward in the space about data and new technology. So I'm excited to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Ann. And finally, we are blessed to be joined by an individual who has been looking at issues of cybersecurity on the global stage for many, many years, who has worked all over the country, has worked with government as well as Fortune 2000 companies, is the author of Inside Cyber Warfare, and all right, I'll say it, is our token security professional at the table with us, Jeffrey Carr. Jeff, you have the widest perspective on what security people love and what they hate. So tell us a little bit, introduce yourself, and what's on your mind these days.
Thanks so much, Greg, and it's really an honor to be here with such a stellar group of people. I've long been an admirer of Ward's and Mike at Netflix. I am astounded that Netflix has not suffered any kind of breach, considering how other media companies could care less about security. Mike, you should be consulting for Sony, honestly. And that's really where security people are frustrated, because when breaches do occur, they occur at such a simple level. With tools that are, or vulnerabilities that are 10 years old or longer. It's as if innovation leaves security behind because it slows it down. So it's like innovation is a train you just don't get in its way. And if you try to talk to the conductor of the train about, hey, wait a minute, you're exposing all of your passengers to increased risk by adding this new innovation, you just get thrown off the train pretty much. Stop, bothering us about these things. And I've seen this time and again at very large companies, especially companies in the defense sector that are they're the largest targets probably on Earth, and fend off incredibly sophisticated attacks. And they constantly receive requests for adding some new product, some new device, something that's going to expand their threat landscape by thousands of nodes, maybe hundreds of thousands of nodes that now have to additionally be protected. And when they push back, they get a lot of heat for it. So that is what I've witnessed in terms of the conflict between innovators and security people. As a business, as a CEO of a small company, I love innovation because our product basically protects innovators. Any innovations are valuable. So we actually track international research and development projects, and then that are government funded, and then we match those, sort of like a dating service, with U.S. companies that are innovating in the same area, because you have the immediate adversary-victim relationship. This government is spending millions on an innovation that you also happen to be working on. That makes you a high-value target. So we're able to help you identify early interest in your innovative work. So from that standpoint, I love it. From a security standpoint, I honestly refuse to do a lot of things in the digital world because I simply don't trust it.
While Jeff was going on, Matt, I saw a couple of smiles grace your face, and I think that there was a let's for the moment kind of trying to enumerate some of the specific problems and whether they're real. Let's blame the innovators just for a moment. Are the innovators kind of disregarding what the security people are saying, and that's just creating an issue?
So, yeah, I was smiling because Jeff was using the metaphor of a train, and yesterday Greg and I were talking, and I started using the metaphor of an airplane to describe a very similar interaction between security personnel and innovators. Before I get started on that, I want to distinguish between two types of innovators. One is the technologist, and one is the non-technical organization leader who wants to do lots of innovative things. If you're the technologist at an organization, you may view your security counterpart as very anti-risk. And you'd be fair to do that because it seems like everything you are asking for, the security person just says, no, we can't do that. But what I've learned is that that security person has a different vantage point. And their vantage point is that you're not asking them to take a single risk. You're asking them to take a single risk from a pre-existing position of great risk. And that's something that only that security person can fully appreciate, because their job every day is to watch their vulnerable infrastructure get attacked and to fend off those attacks. And their task is to go to the non-technical leadership of the organization and say, we are in a position of great risk, we need to do something about this. But all too often, the non-technical leader wants to be seen as an innovator, because innovation is a great buzzword these days. So, it's very easy to say, well, I don't see our stuff being attacked, or we haven't had a data breach yet, so I'm going to worry about that later, or not at all. And as we've seen many times over the last year, all of these companies that get attacked We later find out that, oh, their cybersecurity personnel knew that there were huge vulnerabilities, and they told their executives about that, but the executives just put it off because they didn't want to spend money on a threat that was not as tangible to them as it was to the professionals who are tasked with fighting it.
So I think that you've just described what you've done is you've identified that there's at least three people that are in the conversation, or three roles. It's not just the innovator and the security professional. It's the technology innovator who's talking to the security, the individual who's responsible for security, and then that individual is actually having a conversation with the executive or the non-technical innovator, and so that there is asymmetrical information between these three parties when they're talking with each other. And I want to Henry and Mike. I want Mike McGarr. I want you guys to weigh in, because Henry, I know we have talked about what happens with the number of relationships, social relationships, when you have more than 3 or 4 people in a room, and the different types of relationships that form. And I'm curious, Mike, having listened to what Jeff and Matt were pointing out, how those relationships might get handled at Netflix. So, Henry, let me give it to you first, and then Mike.
Oh yeah, there's something interesting about people. I noticed in small businesses, and I started a few companies, and I noticed that when you have 3 or 4 people in a group together, you've got the leader, and you've got a critic that shows up, and then you've got somebody that supports the leader. But there's always a critic. There's a person that's like shooting things down. There's a dynamic, a systems dynamic of human behavior. In larger groups, you'll have a comedian sometimes that shows up. It's a lot like family dynamics. You got, and what's interesting is I had a business once, and we had the comedian, and he left, and somebody else took the job. It wasn't a job description. It was just this energy description inside the system. It's the most bizarre thing. And I've noticed that, like group sizes, companies that are 7 people or people have a lot of fun. When you get up to about 14 or 15 people, like in the big experiences of moves, when they study the happiness of group sizes, it tanks around 14. It's like there's some fighting going on, energy, alpha male stuff. There's this program running in our lower brain that is like it's like takes over. And it's like that's programming. And I'm having conversations in people in DC, and they're like, yeah, that's the problem we have here. It's like there's these problems of human behavior that are just like underneath. They're like ghosts in the machine, and those are the things that I think are really challenging.
Mike,
like
do you see do you see the challenge at the level of technology, or is it really the relationship? And if so, how does an organization like Netflix kind of address those issues?
Yeah, I'm gonna kind of cop out a little bit on this one, but no, not really. So when it was Matthew was talking, what struck me was I was reflecting on my experiences, and what's striking about my experiences in government, and even outside of Netflix and non-government, and then coming to Netflix, the big difference is culture. And this is something you hear a lot in the DevOps community, and I'll make sure to share the link to the Netflix culture deck. But what I was hearing from Matthew was there's security people who are responsible for security, and they will notify executives about risks. And how it differs here is that the conversations between individual contributors, ICs, so you'll have a security expert talking to individual engineers at Netflix, and the jobs of managers are to provide context to engineers at Netflix, so that they understand that there is a balance between innovation and security, and it's my job to make sure my guys know what the priorities are, and not necessarily how to solve the problems, and it's their responsibility to have that to solve the problems. Now, Netflix's magic is honestly its culture, and that has been striking since I've joined. That is the big difference. It's about how managers manage through context and not control. It's hiring great talent and having trust in the engineers to solve the problem. And it's amazing how if you empower an engineer to say, we trust that you'll do the right thing for the company, how they will have conversations with security saying, how can I make sure that my innovative change will be also secure and won't risk the whole company? And sharing that innovation and security across everyone, making everyone responsible.
Is there specific language or part of the culture deck in which you assign that describes how you assign that kind of responsibility to the engineer?
Yeah, so the culture deck, the saying we have a lot is freedom and responsibility, right? So when you get hired at Netflix, we are hiring you because we trust you, we think you're going to do great things, and we give you a lot of freedom to solve the problems in the ways that you think are best. And with that freedom comes responsibility. And the two go hand in hand. You can't separate those two. And in toxic cultures that I've been in, I've seen engineers that take that freedom and then they punt the responsibility to ops, to security, to testing, to a number of organizations that they're basically saying, I wrote code, you make it run, you make sure it's secure, it's not my job. And by putting them responsible for the security and the operations and the quality of the system, you have them asking different questions, and they're actually seeking out experts to make sure that what they're doing is the right thing for the company. And then that leads to a whole bunch of goodness.
I'm seeing some of our panelists head nod. I know. Does anyone want to weigh in here? I know where I want to go. Mike.
Yeah. So a couple of things. I mean, I think on groups that I've led in government, so a couple of things that Mike said rang true to me. Groups that I've led, my experience leads me to believe there isn't a developer that has been on a team of mine or that I've worked with who wants to royally mess up. Who wants to like just open up the keys to the kingdom and let travesty happen from a security point of view. Like we want to make great product, and we want that to be secure and have users use it. And so there's this notion early on. Greg and I have had this conversation before. Early on in some of the NIST standards that calls for things like separation of duties, which by nature puts up this wall that you as a developer only have this one duty to develop an application, and you as a data manager can only push data in or data out. And the great negative thing that comes from all of that is this lack of inherent trust that I think Mike was speaking to. That culture shift needs to happen. That culture shift of with freedom comes great responsibility. I think that's a great opportunity. But there's one thing I kind of want to go back to that I think Jeff was saying, and Jeff, not to pick on you at all, but we see this analogy lots in the security innovation paradigm, where when we describe risk or we describe security as a functional oversight, we put it in the context of, let's say, the defense industry. And by the way, to Matt's earlier point of one of the black holes being procurement, we do the same thing. Like in procurement training, we say, let's say you want to buy an aircraft carrier. Well, the use cases for the defense security system and the use cases for buying an aircraft carrier are not only really specific, they're not everyone's use case. By and large, I'm developing systems that are all open data. They're already built on this incredibly low-risk matrix that Ann was speaking of earlier. And and again, I'm not picking on you, Jeff, by saying the one-size-fits-all paradigm happens when we talk about the defense analogy. It's just they come up a lot. And so there has to be those conversations when innovators get to security individuals and vice versa, where there isn't a trump card of going, well, if this were a defense system, well, it's not. We're talking about, in many cases, simple front-end design, accessing simple data. So, we need to make sure that those conversations happen in a balanced framework.
I agree I think it's very interesting. You had my head spinning on a couple of things in terms of listening to Mike McGarr at Netflix, kind of describing where there's a strong emphasis on culture and establishing a culture and a set of priorities and allowing people to create a process inside of that in order to get the work done. And Mike describing, I think, for many of us who have worked in government, that often there is a process that tries to create culture, and we get stuck with a definition of the process and how that impacts. So coming, how far does culture get us in addressing this issue of collaboration? Does it get us 50% of the way there? Does it get us 100% of the way there? How far does it get us? And what happens if you have that culture when you still have someone, an advanced persistent threat, find its way into the system? What impact does the dedicated attacker have on the establishment of that culture?
So
I'm going to just throw that out there.
Yeah, I'll throw in my 2 cents based on my experiences, and then I would love to hear from other people. But in my experience in government, the challenge of creating this culture is you have this element that, for instance, at Netflix we don't have, is a lot of IT, a lot of innovation in IT is centered in the government around contractors, and there are a lot of good contractors out there. And I felt, and I agree with, I think it was Michael, was talking about, there's a lot of good people, and I remember really trying to do the right thing for the government, but my hands being tied a lot of times. And what struck me is when I stopped being a contractor and being, internal to a company, there's this inherent trust that everyone there is working for the good of the company, which isn't always there with contractors. And I think that will slow down that cultural change in the government. That was one of the most striking things, and one of the places where I was able to be successful as a contractor, interestingly enough, was when it wasn't that there was a culture of trust, but there was a culture of giving our company space, which I guess what ended up being trust, to solve the problem in the way we thought was best, and we ended up doing what was best for the government because we wanted to. And when I failed is when there was a culture of high control, where the government would tell me specifically, I can't do this, I can't do that, this is what I have to do, and this is, even though I had areas where I wanted to bridge, like I wanted to solve the problem, maybe even using something like test-driven development, I would get pushback on in certain pockets of the government because that wasn't how they did things, and that wasn't how they were comfortable. So that context, not control, and trust, I think it's going to be a struggle for sure in the government.
I'll just jump in here. That this is one reason I was the computer scientist in the organizational behavior department studying technology management. It was so clear to me how these issues are related. And there have been a lot of studies that culture has a great impact because you have to have some way to interact with the other people who are in your group, and through that interaction, it's possible to do good work. It's not the only requirement, but it is a fundamental thing to have that's possible. Something I see here in DC, I teach at George Mason in the School of Policy, Government, and International Affairs. A lot of my students are those contractors, and they are they are the people who are trying to build that trust between the two, and it's a huge thing because a lot of them are, they're master's students, and they're working towards these things in the government. But it's really, it's difficult to do. I'll close there because something just came up on my screen.
I wanted, this is Jeff, I wanted to add a couple of points to this discussion. One is, I agree with Michael that it really does depend on the company and the resource or the assets that they're attempting to build and innovate upon. Frankly speaking, if it's we all look in the security business. We look at this in terms of value to foreign governments. So, what is the value of a company finding new ways to build homes for the poor? Well, there's probably some value to it. I'm not sure if a mercenary hacker group would find a sufficient market for that data to warrant stealing it and turning it around and selling it. So the risk may be low for an intrusion, and therefore the debate between the security team and the innovation team really shouldn't be that much. Versus high-value data, high-value innovations, high-value research and development in sectors that are highly valuable and highly targeted. And that's where the debate and the heavy conflicts of interest come into play. But having said that, I think it's important to point out that even if you do come to an agreement and you can build security in to a new product, and that both teams work excellently together, like at Netflix, if you have a dedicated attacker, he's going to compromise that system. So it's impossible to build a system that is 100% secure.
So I think you've brought out one of the elephants, and you've drawn our attention. So I guess I'm gonna do this. If it's impossible to make a system 100% secure, why should the innovator worry about it at all? You know, I think that's one of the elephants in the room that's not talked about. And related to that is, if you can't protect the system from a dedicated attacker, why are we seeing so many breaches, as you yourself pointed out, that are coming from simple things that people aren't doing?
Because, well, so the answer to your first question is the reason why an innovator needs to be worried about this. Even though it's impossible to have a 100% secure system, you want to make it as difficult as possible. You don't want to be the first person that a hacker team will go after. If it looks like it's going to cost them too much in time or resources, and they can find a different company doing similar work, then they'll just go with the most efficient route. Furthermore, if you are an innovator and you use this as an excuse not to build in security, then your company will go out of business, because your ability to sell is your ability to protect your intellectual property. If you can't protect it, somebody else will copy it. You'll be done. So, just from a purely business point of view, it's suicide. As far as why attackers use simple, like spear phishing and SQL injection and these age-old, timeless, low-cost means to break into a network, is because they still work. So your attackers are efficient people, and they don't want to waste expensive malware when simple malware or social engineering can do the trick.
So I'm agreeing with Jeff. I find myself in pretty violent agreement with the substance of what you're describing, and yet I have a lingering question of if this is the right way to talk about it, because I do think that there might be another way to describe to the innovator that there's value in doing security on a day-to-day basis, in spite of in spite of. Let me rephrase. I think that it is easy for a lot of innovators to throw up their hands and say, look, something could break in anyway. I'm not going to go to this much work, because it's all a shell game. And I think that it's easy for some people, or as Matt was saying earlier, for the executive innovator to say, well, I don't quite get what's happening. We haven't had a problem yet. So I'm not faulting what you're saying, Jeff, but I'm kind of saying, like, is there a better conversation that shifts people's points of view? I don't know if anyone has a thought on that, but I don't know if that discussion has driven the change that we wanted to drive, although I completely agree with your substance. I'm gonna toss this over to Ward because he is indicating some things in the chat, and also, but I'll let him respond to that, and then I have a question for him.
You know, the thing that I was trying to get at is what is it about government, or what is it about, or you know, what is it about religion that has prevented these systems from actually solving the problems that are in front of us? We know that there are solutions that have been developed decades ago. You know, public key cryptography, you know, is from my college days, and that was a long time ago. You know, but it is not widespread. Instead, we're still asked to memorize passwords. And you know, after a while, you know, 20, 30, 40 passwords, you know, you just start doing it wrong, ways you know that are wrong. And you know, so there you go. It's these simple things. And the, oh, don't click on links in your email. Well, why do we even have links in our email? You know, it's silly, but we know that the vendors who provide us with this computer equipment are simply not incented to solve this problem. They're not organized to solve that problem. The shareholders don't want them to solve that problem, you know, and so we can't look to business to solve it. And I'm not sure we can look to government to solve it either, but they try a little harder, I think, and that's why they feel the burden more. But, you know, again, I said don't solve a system problem with people, you solve a system problem with systems, and it's time to get to work on those systems.
So I think a thread, Ward, what you were just saying in terms of you've also agreed with Jeff that there are some inherent risks that are always going to happen. Things can't be perfectly secure, but we're still doing we're not doing the best things. And I think that I want to hark back to the fact of what Mike was saying is, even if we know that we can't be completely secure, our experience with the process in some cases, especially inside of government, is unnecessarily painful, and it's making our jobs miserable, rather than incentivizing us as Mike was describing. And Ward, when you were talking earlier, I think there's a space that you have operated in which progress is made by creating common language among the participants. That there's actually, in developing C2.com and developing the wiki there, and also Agile, there's a process where it's not just getting people to talk, but it is creating shared language and new language among the participants, which actually helps drive cultural shifts and build systems.
I'll go back to, you know, 30 years ago, there was a conversation that programmers could not produce quality, you know, and we had to have a quality department to enforce quality into the sloppy computer programmers' work. And all we did is we just elevated that to the point where programmers, you know, amongst all the other things they had to do, had to accept some responsibility for knowing that their software worked. And you know, quality, that level of quality is not a simple metric. It's not a scale of 1 to 10. It is some of the more complicated decisions we make. What does it make to make good? What does it mean to make good code? You know, well, you know, every lunchtime table conversation I have here is, you know, in some sense, you know, people trying to figure out what is good, how do we make good? And, you know, it's going to take a similar effort to really make quality, or make security routine. You know, we can't patch it on from outside. Everybody who writes every line of code has got to be thinking about security while they write that, but they have to think of it in terms that they can actually still get their job done. And if your job is security, you're going to layer on all kinds of complexity and hoops to jump through and so forth, and that's going to quash the innovation. You have to let the innovators get the job done while they're innovating.
So Ward, what's the recommendation, or what's the secret to igniting that conversation which elevates the quality, in the same way that that programmers started talking about quality and it elevated quality? How do we apply that to the question of security? And then after that, I think, Mike, the point that you're making about your experiences would be great. But what's the secret to make that conversation take place?
I think the thing that we did is we said, basically that it's expected, that you're expected to write code that gets better every week.
Who said that? Because it's not like there aren't people saying that right now about security. So who was it when you said we said that? Well,
it was kind of in the object-oriented programming days, and everybody said, well, object-oriented programming is so complicated, we don't understand what we're supposed to do with it. And so there was a door open there. There was a new technology, and we said, well, part of this new technology is that you have more responsibility to understand what your code is going to do over its lifetime. So something happened. Oh, and then we came up with dozens of practices. We said, well, practice this, practice that, So we basically said, by the way, here's what you do. And that's kind of been lost, but that was called extreme programming at the time, and it was considered extreme because, like the skier who jumps off a cliff and falls 40 feet and lands in the deep powder and pops out the other side, you look at that, you say, that's so extreme. How could he possibly take a risk like that? Well, it isn't a risk because he does that all the time. He's mastered that skill of jumping off of cliffs and coming out feeling good about it. Well, we just did the same thing. Extreme programming says it sounds extreme, master it, and that's what we need. And it'll help if there's some sort of breakthrough that pushes us forward. And it should have been the web. The web should have said, oh, the web is completely different, but we have to think about security like we never thought about it before, but we forgot to do that. So maybe it's the cloud, or maybe it's the next thing, but it's going to take that class of effort.
I'm there. You have. I think that you've touched a nerve. There's some interesting chat going on between our panelists. So let's quickly go through some points. I think that people want to make in a little rapid order because we're starting to shift towards specific things we can do. Mike, Mike McGarr, you were saying a couple things about what makes it easier to have this conversation for engineers.
So yeah, I would say to Ward's point, there's two halves of this, which is engineers should take responsibility for building quality code, and if you have a silo of a security team that's taking responsibility, you're going to find that those engineers are going to take less and less responsibility. So I definitely am a firm believer in XP and TDD, love it. But also, in an organization, if you think about enabling innovation and security, providing facilities for that whenever an engineer makes a change, to get rapid feedback on whether that change is secure or not, and giving them awareness, right? So, like, have I introduced an open source library that maybe has some security vulnerabilities? Have I, made a change to the web application that I'm building that introduces that allows SQL injection, right? Providing that feedback, and as part of the deployment process, I think that sort of makes it successful. And I partnered a lot with security people when I was in government on trying to get them to understand my desire to move fast through continuous deployment and how we can fit their processes like security scans into our process of deploying code and meeting both needs at the same time.
Great. Mike, did you want to weigh in really quick?
Yeah, super quick, Greg. I mean, you started that whole thread with this notion of a common language, and while I think that's important, what I see in the approaches to common language are often things like there's still someone that's going to call a trump card. Oftentimes, in my experience, that has been someone saying no, like we're not going to do that, we're not going to take on that risk. And when we see that, we're not really seeing a common language. We're not seeing the equal respect of the developer who wants to do work and the security engineer who wants to keep things secure. It's no, this is the way it has to be. There's some kind of Trump thing in security. And so I think it needs to start way before common language. It needs to start at, like, just basic professionalism, that we have a desire to work as a team and get product to market that generates whatever business we're involved in.
So we've had a couple people in the back channel mention lawyers and the compliance process, and so and obviously lawyers weigh big when it comes to language, and I'm now seeing smiles from several people, including Jeff. So there is a thread that has popped up in the background as we started talking about these relationships in language, which have touched on compliance and lawyers getting involved. And that ranges from, Matt, what you would, if you'd like to weigh in here, and then Jeff, what we were talking about, some new developments with people with insurance companies getting involved in security risk. And Ann, too.
Well, we've spoken this whole time, I guess, for about an hour now without saying the word FISMA. FISMA is what drives government IT security. Ward was just saying a few minutes ago that he doesn't think the private sector can do it, and the government does a better job at it, but we can't look to them to do it. These two parties are trying to do different things. The private sector is trying to make money to stay in business. That's their calculus. The government's incentives, unfortunately, are not to secure their systems. Their incentives are to comply with the law. And that law is the Federal Information Security Management Act. I'm not a FISMA expert. I don't know if anyone on the panel is, but I've seen many government cybersecurity staff, work. They spend time preparing for an audit, and there are many audits to face when you're a government cybersecurity person, instead of trying to lock down systems. And that is, don't get me wrong, that is what they prefer to do. They're experts in securing systems. But the job in government so often turns into a paperwork exercise, because at the end of the day, that is what will get you fired, and in some cases, if you're the CIO, land you in prison, is if you fail an audit. Not if you have a breach, but if you fail an audit. And you can have a system that is horribly vulnerable and pass an audit, and you can have a system that is incredibly secure and still fail an audit. And I don't know. I hope we can start talking about that, because Mike, you were just talking about shared language versus culture. I think those things matter, but to me, that culture is driven by a law. So take, for example, Section 508. Section 508 of I think it's called the Rehabilitation Act, is what says that federal government websites must be accessible to disabled persons. You can have a website that is very poorly designed, but still be 508 compliant. Just like you can have an IT system that is compliant with FISMA but still not secure. We have a law that is driving technical compliance, as opposed to, a law is a legal compliance tool, and in these cases, it is trying to drive technical compliance. And when you've got technologies that move much faster than the legal process, or I guess I should say the legislative process, it's not going to make sense to have a law driving technical compliance. I guess I'll stop there and see what anyone else has to say about that.
The great, I think one of the movements we were getting in the conversation about the potential for culture to drive, to enhance responsibility and engagement, and creating that culture. When you're inside of government, you run into an issue in which is that you have law that defines process, and so that that becomes an added barrier for providing change. Jeff, are we going to see law start impacting the culture of cybersecurity and innovation for software companies?
Sure. The SEC eventually will convert its cybersecurity guidance into regulation. Then companies will be forced to reveal cyber risk factors to their stockholders, so that their investors know how vulnerable or how not vulnerable they are, to an attacker. That'll be very influential once that happens. But also the cyber insurance companies are still a very small percentage of their policies are protecting companies against a breach. But I just spoke at a cyber insurance liability summit last week, and one of the interesting things they spoke about in the area of subrogation or recovery of assets that were stolen was that since they won't be able to recover assets that were stolen by a foreign hacker, then how about going after the cybersecurity company that provided the so-called protection that failed, on the network? So cybersecurity vendors have never been held responsible for the efficacy of their product. It's possible that it's in discussions, at least, among cyber insurance carriers that if they can't recover from the hacker, maybe they can recover from the cybersecurity vendor whose product failed. So that will also, again, that's all driven by lawyers. And
So I'm feeling that we are actually on the cusp of a change. There's an opportunity, as Ward was describing earlier, that we've got new technology. It didn't happen with the new technology of the web, but we now have the new technology of the cloud. We have the new technology and the kind of the new culture of DevOps. And we also have the evolution of technology being embedded in the Internet of Things, like the cars that we drive. So there's so this might create the opportunity for us to have this conversation of who's now responsible for what, and and how do we need to think about what we're building. And if I can impose on you, since you've looked at organizational aspects and technology, if we are at a moment in time where we have an opportunity to shift the conversation, what should we be doing in the roles that we're all in as panelists, and what should we be thinking about as developers, as security professionals, as innovators, in order to open up this space for this conversation?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that there are a lot of constraints on the system. We talked about the cultural constraints and that impact. This conversation has brought up liability, right? There are always legal constraints on what we do. And there are regulatory constraints that are very real for some industries. I have been looking at, I used to work for finance and what's going on. We've mentioned the Security and Exchange Commission. It's huge what's happening and how that's being changed through regulation. But I also think it's important to consider the budgetary constraints when we're talking about government, because budgets don't flow normally from year to year, and that's a very real concern in terms of managing these projects and keeping them flowing. There's been some research done about different types of budgets that spur innovation, so there can be a budget. The budgets that get people to really innovate quickly are the small little cookie jar little funds that people are like, hey, go try this. We got 10,000, we got whatever it is. Go off and try that. And we need to start thinking about how to fund this in innovative ways. So it's not like we have some huge project that has to have some huge result, and then therefore we're not going to be agile enough to respond to things that happen. And this world needs a response that's quick. The new master's program that we have here at Mason on international security is part of that. The things that are happening in the world right now are not things that we could have ever planned for. Who could have planned for Ebola? Who could have planned for a flash crash? We are now confronting things that are happening so fast. We have to think about security in a broad way, and as part of that aspect of liability, we have to think about it in an international plane, because the people who are hacking into our servers are not necessarily regulated under US law. So this is a whole different ball of wax of how we think of all of this. So all of these areas have to come together. We have to think about budgetary things and regulatory and legal all at once. So it's
well, I love the idea that we have to have a conversation about budget, and that we have to think about that if we want to drive change, we have to look at maybe a certain type of budget, which is a smaller budget, which is compatible with innovation. Are there other things that, you know, Henry's role as a CEO of a government contractor, or Jeff's role in advising many people on security and as product, or Michael Byrne's role inside of government? I'm going to push you a little bit. Are there other types of missteps to avoid, or things to run to, which will facilitate the dialogue that we need to have?
Well, I think an important point is trying to get all of these people at the table. And I think it's looking around and seeing who is there, who is speaking, who is not speaking. One of the great case studies about federal government spending is what happened at the Federal Bureau of Investigation with their virtual case file, the FBI. And it was very clear that the technologists were not at the table in planning that system. And with that, the contractors were at the table, but the contractors, the managers of the contractors were at the table. Again, not the technologists. And things really went in a different direction when the internal technology people got to the table and started talking about how to fix it, and the technologists who were working for the contractors were there. So it's very clear that once you just sort of see who's in the conversation, you can start to figure out what the likelihood of success might be.
Really interesting. So a big thing we can do is first of all look at who is having this conversation, who's at the table, and what are they saying. Mike, did you have some thoughts?
Yeah. So in addition to who, I think it's when, right? So you know, in my experience, early engagement fosters a lower overall cost if, as Mike from Netflix was saying, if there's that equal trust amongst parties in the conversation. So if early engagement is just you know, rhetoric, like, you know, sure, whatever, we'll get to it, then that early engagement doesn't manifest itself in a lower overall cost. And what I've seen in the past in other situations where you lack the early engagement, you end up with, you know, you throw something over the wall at the end, and whoever the compliance reviewer is, whether it's privacy or security or legal, whoever has, you know, a last is at the place of deployment, and they're answering some compliance question. That's just a bad way of doing business, because for whatever reason they could put a stop to it and say, no, we're not going to deployment, and then you miss all of those, you know, sunk cost opportunities. So when we do early engagement, it has to have, you know, the trust factor up front that says, yeah, I understand the kind of problem you're trying to solve, how you're trying to solve it with good code and security and all the things that we need to put in place. But lacking that, you end up with a delay in things that lead to overall cost increases.
So I'm feeling like I'm going to leave this conversation, and we are at the we've got about 15 minutes to go on our scheduled 90-minute video roundtable. and this has moved really fast and has been terribly interesting. I'm beginning to take away that the next steps here are getting people around the table and having more conversations and understanding exactly what is the opportunity or both the moment of crisis that we're faced with as a way of opening up the door for conversations of who's responsible for what and how to and elevating accountability in the systems. And I think that's I'm wondering if anyone has other thoughts of who are some people right now that might be having this conversation, which we could go join, or other things that we need to do in the next 6 months or 18 months to help ensure this shift, which I think we're all looking at and hoping will take place and make our jobs more fun.
Well, I'll volunteer one observation, and that is that the innovators, invest their time. You work and you work and you work. Edison said that's the 99% perspiration part, and the returns come at the rate the returns come. That you're working on a problem, and the problem is solved when it's solved. Now, an investor works a different way. An investor invests money, not time, and they don't want to wait. They're looking not at the returns, they're looking at the rate of return. And they're going to compare one investment against another to see which one has the best rate. And that's because they're trying to magnify their money. And the returns are almost incidental. Now, that means that the innovator, time, T, is in the numerator of the formula. The more time, the more return. And the investor, time is in the denominator. The more time, the less rate. And that drives business, right? Since Henry Ford's era and DuPont, figuring out how to build conglomerate organizations and make these return on investment judgments. It's a meme that has infected what we think about innovation. We don't think of it. And if we want to combine innovation with security, we've got to take the time. The reason why we have to take the time, that's why business can't do it. Oh, by the way, government can't do it because there's an election coming up. I had the opportunity to sit on the Mayor's Innovation Council, and I said, well, what kind of time frame do we have? And they said, well, the mayor's up for re-election next year. So there you go. And I know it was mentioned, funding cycles and so forth. That either we have a government research lab or we have an industrial research lab, an AT&T or a Xerox PARC or a NIST or something like that, where there's professionals who can work this problem until it's solved. That's what we have to do. It isn't the rate of return problem. It's a return problem.
That was fascinating. Including the notion of time and the different parties' perspective of it is really going to give me something to chew over. What's the dimension? Where is time as it applies to security? Is it in the numerator, denominator, or somewhere else?
The integration we're looking for, the thing that we ask for, how are we going to make this, each part love the other? That's a numerator problem. In the short term, we can still say, we've got to ship secure software, and we've got to pass an audit. Passing an audit reminds me of, we've got to make clean code, at the end of the month. Sure, there's a schedule, and you have to live with the schedule, and kind of figuring out how to deal with schedules and clean code. Now we have to deal with audits, right? We have to deal with security departments, and so that's part of the problem. But the deep solutions, those things not loom over us because we're going to be working on a deeper problem. And I think someone mentioned self-driving cars. Maybe that's going to be the thing that drives it. You know, where we simply cannot afford to have the software not work
or be secure.
Yes.
Well, so we're coming up on our final 10 minutes, so I think this is a great chance to get final thoughts on this topic as well as the conversation we've been having. So anyone who'd like to volunteer some thoughts or reactions, or Matt?
Yeah.
Greg, so much for inviting me.
Oh, thank you, Ward. It's been great having you. Matt?
Yeah. Well, I think teeing off what Ward said about self-driving cars, I think we're going to continue having this conversation, or our grandchildren are going to keep having this conversation of how do we make our innovations secure, as long as we don't get to the root of it. And from the experts that I talk to, I get the sense that the root of it is the fact that the internet is not built to be secure, and that it needs to be rebuilt from the ground up with a more security-oriented mindset. And until that happens, what Jeff said about no system being secure will always be true. And it will always be true regardless. But reconfiguring the internet it might be the first step. Mike, you might have thoughts on that. Being, I don't know who the most qualified network engineer is on the panel, but that's my parting thought.
Henry, final thoughts?
Oh, that's very provocative. Rebuilding the internet. The planet isn't secured, so that's the way it shows up for me. I took away a few things. One is there's, and I'm not sure who it was, but there's a fast feedback on deployment, like giving that to engineers, to people that are working on things. That's something that I think gives somebody motivation to like be more secure. Like just noticing that they're secure or not, and giving people feedback. Removing security from the silo was another thing that struck. That was like, yeah, of course, you silo something and it's somebody else's job. It's pretty simple. Creating a culture where we redefine good to include secure, which was also mentioned. I thought that stuck with me, and really the law defining process. Wow, what a mess that puts us in. So how we fix that, I don't know. This brought up a whole lot of questions for me. Not a lot of answers, but it was really awesome. It was really great to see all of you innovate together.
Anne, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to get in to say that innovation's not going to stop, and in fact, we're in a world where we have to have innovation. Things are happening so fast, and they're happening in ways that we cannot anticipate. So we're going to need to keep this level of innovation going, and with it requires some security. So that way, if the innovation moves into a final production level item or application, that it will last and we can move forward and then build on it. We need innovations that can be built on so we can move forward.
Jeff, as a innovator and as a security person, do you love yourself better now? Do you love those two parts of yourself?
Oh, sure. I mean, I was happy with those two conflicting parts before, but I am very skeptical about the future of that. I think one solution. Well, I think that two solutions are sort of carrot and the stick. So you all have talked a lot about solutions that I would qualify as carrots, but the reality, as I know it, is that CEOs, C-level suite, boards of directors, they're not going to change until you have a stick, and that's probably going to mean when a breach occurs, that there are lawsuits in multi-million-dollar or billion-dollar range. Right now, when a breach occurs, like an insurance company breach that recently happened, the only thing that they do is pay for credit monitoring, which is insulting. It's laughably inadequate. Credit monitoring does nothing to protect the people who suffered and may suffer in the future, from that breach. So that has to happen. Companies have to feel the pain before I think that you see fundamental change. But individual employees, I think, could respond better through some of the more carrot type scenarios that you all have been discussing.
Thank you. We've there has been a discussion that has been going on Twitter. Since this is my kind of first video roundtable, I was a little too absorbed to be able to balance all the different social media. But we have had a couple of interesting points, including Fen Lebaum suggesting that we need an open source community-driven FedRAMP-like process to engage people. And I think that Exec Tara via Twitter has said that there seems to be that there's cyber threats with time and how fast we can deliver code or to respond to those. Mike, I'm going to let you guys battle it out for I think which is going to be the last word here. The two mics, one on the outside, one on the inside. What are your takeaways from the conversation that we've been having?
I'll go first. I'll give Mike the last one. So, thanks so much, Greg. It's great to be part of the conversation. It's totally wonderful to be in it. I'm left with a couple things. One, in my head, and this works for so many things, there's no panacea. There isn't one thing that we can throw at this and have it solved. So I think this is going to go on for quite some time. But I'm left with this very interesting tension discussion. So there's something that I think it was Ward that said we need to have systems solve system problems, not people. And so we have to let machines work, and that's super innovative and wonderful. And at the same time, when it comes to actually getting things to deployment, we're still in a person-to-person mode. We still have to have trust between the architects and the engineers and the security people. So we have this dramatic tension, I think, between people trusting each other to do work and machines that need to solve machine problems. And that's a fascinating piece of tension.
Oh, that's a great insight. Mike McGarr?
Yeah, no, what I'm struck with is and Ward touched on this and Jeffrey touched on this as well, which is the motivators for risk versus innovation, right? I mentioned in the chat, private sector, I've seen the tension being pulled more to delivering features and focusing on innovation because there's a real business advantage there and throwing away risk. And that tension has failed in a lot of companies where they've gotten security breaches, and in some cases to the extreme, the company died because of that security breach. With government, we're talking about these motivators are heavily motivated towards on the risk mitigation side, which is compliance, and making sure that a government CIO is not getting his name on the front page of the Washington Post, right? For a failed project. So these motivators are interesting, and they play into the carrot and stick conversation, and whether or not something like government or an organization like a private organization can change. The intrinsic and extrinsic motivators and how they influence an organization's ability to adapt and change to balance innovation and security.
Well, thank you very much to all of my panelists that you have made the first Transforming Government IT Reinventors Roundtable a resounding success. You have put on on the table some really interesting topics and ideas which I think are going to lead to further discussions and probably bringing lawyers into the discussion as well. I think that has come up. So thank you all again. It was a privilege listening to these ideas, and we will be. And I think Peter, you should wrap this up because you've done it before and take us out of here.
Hey, awesome conversation. Really is up there among the very best liftoff for a new series. So really thanks everyone here. I just want to remind folks that we will be doing edited videos of this. We will essentially be doing write-ups on this. We'll have a package that's done by the end of the week. We'll be pushing it out aggressively next week. So do spread this around, push this in. We need to get these ideas out to the right folks. And so help us do that. But anyhow, thank you everyone. Awesome conversation.